Hello, in this video I'm going to show you how you can use logic to beat problems in your life such as anxiety, and I'm going to explain how people think and some common thinking traps people fall into, also things that are used by salespeople and politicians to trick people into agreeing with them even when they don't actually speak factually and they're just making it up. My name's Paul and I work online with people all over the world to help them overcome their fear of driving. Most people have at least partly a logical element to their problem. Very often it's not this, it's 99% of the things that you need to work on in therapy, but sometimes it's partly logical and sometimes it's very, very rarely it can be entirely logical. So let's have a look at what logic is, and then I'm going to tell you about a case study of somebody I worked with whose problem we fixed purely with logic. So let's start by looking at the thinking journey. So logical thinking consists of a start and a finish, known as a premise and conclusion. And this is the correct kind of conclusion because there are many false conclusions people can come to about their life which can cause problems. But for now we're just talking about the correct and true conclusion. A premise is a statement that begins the journey. A conclusion is the end of that journey. So logical thinking takes you from a premise to a conclusion via a series of sound steps. This is important, sound steps. Sound as in true, factual, honest. This is what we mean by sound, not sound as in hearing something. Let's continue with this. So logical thinking takes you from a premise to a conclusion via a series of sound steps where each makes logical progression from the previous. So this is where people go wrong in their life. They jump from a premise to a conclusion, but they miss out the steps. So they go from here to here, but they haven't taken little steps along the way. And if you look to the steps and analyse them, this one here is missing, doesn't make any sense. So then you never reach this conclusion. What people do though is they jump from start to finish and they think, I can't drive, I've concluded I can't drive. And this is what I do, is to help them go back and look for all these little steps and we realise which step you've missed out. So illogical thinking takes you from a premise to a conclusion via a series of steps that do not make sense or are flawed in some way. In this case, even if the premise is true, the conclusion will be false. This is what we just said. So people jump from start to finish and they miss steps out. So let's move on to the next slide. It shows you how to think logically as an equation. So let's look at an example of a logical argument. Now, when I work with clients, people often ask me, how do you do it? What is it you're actually doing in a session? Well, this is what I'm doing in the background. My mind is processing this only in a small way because most of it is to do with other things, not logic. You don't fix anxiety purely with logic most of the time, but sometimes you can. So this is how a logical argument works. All x's are y. All y's are z. Therefore, all x's are z. So this is logical because if all x's are y and all y's are z, that means all x's are z. Now I know this can take a bit of getting your head around, so like I say, you might want to pause this or watch it back, but this makes sense. And when people are talking to me in sessions, this is what I'm listening for, this is what I'm looking for, because some people will do this visually, not speaking. Let's have a look though at a real life example of how this would work. So, all cats are felines, all x's are y. All felines are mammals, all y's are z. Therefore, all cats are mammals, because all x's are z. Now I know when you first hear this, and to be fair, even when you've heard it for a few dozen times, it's really confusing to understand, but what I'm listening for when clients speak to me is they must be saying that all x's are y, all y's are z, and x's are z. This makes it make more sense. All cats are known as felines. All felines are mammals, so all cats are mammals. Watch it back a few times and see if you can get your head around it. But let's move on now to how people think incorrectly, and this is what causes problems such as anxiety. Illogical thinking as an equation. Let's look at an example of an illogical argument which looks logical. Notice that it looks logical. And this is how politicians and salespeople trick people. Because the logic seems to make sense, but it doesn't. And they either know that and they're just tricking you, or they don't know themselves and they've got it wrong and they honestly don't know. Now, I'm not going to name any particular groups, but there are certain arguments going on at the moment and they're doing this and they can't see how they've got it wrong, and there are people marching around protesting about things and they've got it wrong because they're doing this. And I think those poor people, they honestly think they're doing all the good in the world and they haven't got a clue because they're doing this. But let's just get into this. All x's are y. Z is a y, therefore Z is an x. Doesn't make sense, because what that means is all hotels are structures. All x's are y. A bridge is a structure, because all y's are z. Therefore, a hotel is a bridge. Now, a hotel is not a bridge, but you see how it works. Let's go through that again more slowly. All hotels are structures. That's true. A bridge is a structure. That's true. A hotel is a bridge. Wrong. Because you see how what they're doing is they're mixing these things up. Whereas this one made sense because it logically flows step by step by step. In this one, this is when people jump from step to step. You see how it's the wrong way round. They're drawing conclusions about things. So you see, when people get problems such as anxiety, fears and phobias, such as the fear of driving, fear of flying, fear of public speaking, relationships, whatever, it's often because of this, because they are using what they see as logic in their mind, but it's not logical. So what we do in a session, and you don't need to understand all this, by the way, don't worry about that, that's up to me to do, that's my job, that's what I do. You have to find the content, like the hotels, the structures, whatever, but I will supply you with a context. So you do the content, you come up with what the false thoughts are, and I will help you put them into context. And that's what people pay me for, because as you can see, this is not easy to do. This is quite tricky, and it takes a lot to get your head around. Now we're going to have a look at the next page, which shows how sometimes, even if you apply this logic, it can still go wrong, which is what we said at the beginning. This is why I said about logical thinking doesn't work, even if the premise is true, because the steps are flawed in some way. So, this is what we mean by this. If the premise is wrong, the conclusion is wrong. Even if logic, I should say, not logical, even if logical is applied, if there's a false premise, conclusion, it will not correct a false premise. So let's look at this example. All men are pigs. Steve is a man, therefore Steve is a pig. Now this is of course not true, because this premise is just false. It's based on prejudice, it's based on ignorance or whatever. Where this person's thoughts came from that all men are pigs, that's what we will go into in therapy. But you see how even though this follows the same as this, it's wrong because the premise is wrong. So if you get this wrong, even if the logic then follows in a series of logical steps, it will not be true. So there are two types of logical argument. There is a deductive argument, one where the premise supports the conclusion 100%, and there is an inductive argument, one where the premise mostly supports the conclusion and is probably true. Which of these two do you think most arguments are? When you hear politicians speaking, when you hear these groups campaigning for their cause, which of those two do you think 99% of the time they are using? Well, the answer is an inductive argument, because it's actually very hard to have an argument where the premise supports the conclusion 100%, because every time you take a step, there is more room for error, and life is not black and white as this presentation is. There are many, many shades of grey in between, but most arguments are inductive arguments, And what politicians and salespeople will do is they will do this and this, and it will seem logical, but when you understand this, you'll know that it's not. And I know this video is quite confusing, and this is to show people what I do, because sometimes people think, well, you just sit there in a session doing nothing. I'm doing all this in the background. I may not be speaking, but this is what's going on in my head in the background. So let's move on now to the next page. So this is where we start to go from where the limit of logic takes us. Emotion and logic. The emotion often interferes with logic because it twists our thinking into what we want to believe rather than what the facts point to as being true. Imagine you get an email on a dating site from someone who's very attractive. They appear to be your perfect match, but they insist on you sending them £10,000 before you meet. Your mind is screaming out, scam, scam, run, get away from this. But that's logic. And emotion is way, way more powerful than logic. In fact, logic takes up only around 10% of your mind. Emotion accounts for the other 90%. And that's why you get people trapped in relationships where maybe they're being abused in some way, and anyone on the outside can see that that relationship is no good for them, but they just cannot see it because 90% of what you think is emotion, 10% is logic. And this little 10%, this puny little 10%, is never going to beat the emotion. Doesn't happen. There was a famous psychologist called Emile Coué, and he said whenever there is conflict between logic and emotion, emotion will win. It's not exactly what he said, but that's roughly what he was saying, is that emotion beats logic every time. Sometimes you'll get people, and I bet there's someone watching this who's saying, not me, because I'm logical, and I can beat my emotions with logic. Well, I've done that, and that leads to major problems in life, such as depression, because when you suppress one emotion, what you need to understand is emotions come in a package. Okay, so all emotions are tied together. So if you use logic to suppress one emotion, you actually suppress all of them. So if you make yourself not be scared, you also won't be happy, you won't be sad, you'll feel nothing, and you start to get depressed, and that can lead to major mental health problems. So let's move on to the final page of this presentation, and I'm going to explain why you can't fix problems yourself. So why you can't fix this yourself, this relates to driving anxiety or phobias or whatever. You are too trapped in your own head and with your own way of thinking to be able to fix it yourself. This is what the saying, can't see the wood for the trees means. It's funny how, you get this classic sort of comedy scene where someone's in the middle of a wood and they're running around, bouncing off trees saying, I can't find the wood, all these trees are in the way. They're already in the wood, but they can't see the wood for the trees. And this is why you can't fix problems on your own, because as daft as it may sound to someone else, your problem makes sense to you. And here's an example of how the solution to your problem, again another mistake, how the solution to your problem can be so obvious to someone else. So I'm going to tell you about a client I worked with, and I don't normally talk much about clients because it's private, but I'm not giving anything away in this. I'm just going to tell you about the situation, not about the person. I had somebody come to me once who had a fear of driving over bridges, and we went through all the normal stuff, and there was nothing really came up, no kind of emotional problems, no past history of problems or anything like that. So I thought, okay, let's look at it from a logical point of view. And I asked this person, can you just explain what you're doing when you come up to this bridge? And I said, oh yeah, sure. So I'm coming up to the bridge, and when I see it, I take a massive, deep breath, like that. And I hold my breath all the way over the bridge. And I said to them, how long does it take to drive over this bridge? And they said, about 2 to 3 minutes. So you're telling me that when you come to this bridge, you take a massive breath in and you hold your breath for 2 to 3 minutes? Yeah, I start to black out and my hands get all sweaty and shaky and I get stomach pains and my chest hurts. Can anyone work out why that person had a fear of driving over bridges? Well, it's obvious, isn't it? Because they were holding their breath. I mean, I don't know how long most people can hold their breath for, maybe 10 seconds, 20 seconds, certainly not 2 or 3 minutes. No wonder you're starting to pass out and feel terrible when you're driving over a bridge, because you're holding your breath for 2 or 3 minutes. And I just said to him, have you ever driven over this bridge just breathing normally? And he said no. And he went out, and guess what? He drove over the bridge, no problems at all. Now, many times that is not how it works. That's very rare, maybe one client in every 100 or maybe less than that, where it's a logical problem. Beastie logic can be used to fix your problem. But the problem is, you won't see it. And it doesn't matter how silly your problem sounds to other people, you are stuck in the problem, so you won't see it. That's why you need someone else who's an expert, because someone who's just a friend or someone who wants to help you and means well, if they are not trained in this kind of stuff, they won't have a chance, because you need to understand where thoughts come from, how they're formed, deductive and inductive arguments. This is how you help people in therapy. So if you've got a problem you'd like to overcome, contact me through my website, firstdrive.com. There'll be a link in the description below, and if you want help overcoming your fear of driving, get in touch and I'll help you. Check out these other videos on the screen now. Thanks for watching, and as always, I'll see you again soon for more videos.